The cake hadn't even been cut when my mother stood up, tapped her wine glass with a fork, and announced to 40 guests that I had something important to share with the family, something I had never agreed to share, because I had never agreed to do what she was about to demand I do in front of everyone I loved. My name is Hazel. I'm 30 years old, a ceramic artist and owner of a small pottery studio in Asheville, North Carolina, and I was standing in my parents' backyard at what I'd believed was simply my 30th birthday celebration when my mother, Pamela, looked directly at me and said, "Hazel has decided to sign over her grandmother's beach house to help save Lauren's clinic." Isn't that wonderful? Such generosity, finally, from our quieter daughter. I stood frozen near the dessert table, a small plate of cake in my hand, feeling 40 pairs of eyes turned toward me with an expectant warmth that had nothing to do with anything I had actually decided. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. I had spent my entire life hoping, in some quiet, persistent corner of my chest, that my family would eventually see me the way they saw my older sister Lauren, accomplished, decisive, worthy of celebration without qualification. I had built my pottery studio from nothing, taught classes to children and retirees and grieving widows looking for something to do with their hands, found a kind of peace in clay and glaze that I'd never quite found in my own family's presence. But none of that had ever seemed to register, in my parents' eyes, as quite enough. So when my mother stood up at what I'd thought was my own birthday party and announced, to the entire assembled family, that I had agreed to surrender the one inheritance my grandmother had left specifically to me, the beach house on the Outer Banks where I'd spent every meaningful summer of my childhood, I felt something crack open inside me that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't really my birthday party. It never had been. It was an ambush, dressed up in candles and crepe paper, designed to pressure me into signing away the only thing that had ever truly, unconditionally been mine. I set my cake plate down on the table beside me, my hands steadier than I expected, and felt the entire trajectory of my relationship with my family shift, irrevocably, in that single suspended moment before I opened my mouth to respond. To understand how I ended up standing in that backyard, ambushed by my own birthday cake, you need to understand the shape of my family long before that particular August afternoon. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, had been the one constant source of unconditional warmth in my entire childhood, a woman who ran a small antique shop, who smelled perpetually of lavender and clay dust from her own occasional pottery hobby, who had taught me, across countless summers at her beach house, that creating something beautiful with your hands mattered just as much as any of my sister's medical school achievements. My sister Lauren, 3 years older than me, had always been the family's undisputed center of gravity. Brilliant, driven, now running her own struggling medical clinic in Charlotte after years of expensive training and an even more expensive practice launch that had never quite found its footing. My parents spoke about Lauren's achievements with a kind of reverent pride they'd never quite managed for my own quieter accomplishments, the pottery studio, the steady stream of students whose lives I genuinely believed I improved, the small but real reputation I'd built in the regional ceramics community. I told myself, for most of my adult life, that this difference in treatment simply reflected different kinds of accomplishment, that medicine was, understandably, taken more seriously by my parents than art, and that this didn't necessarily mean they loved me any less. I see now how much that belief cost me, how many years I spent hoping that if I simply kept being patient, kept being understanding about the imbalance, my parents would eventually recognize my worth the way they recognized Lauren's. My grandmother had been different. When she passed away 8 months before that birthday party, after a brief illness that had moved faster than any of us expected, her will specified, clearly and without ambiguity, that her beach house, a property now worth well over $2 million given decades of Outer Banks real estate appreciation, would go entirely to me. I remember sitting in Mr. Bradshaw's office during the will reading, feeling something I hadn't expected, not just grief for my grandmother, but a strange, disorienting validation, the sense that someone in my family had truly seen me clearly enough to leave me something this significant, this unconditional. I didn't yet understand how quickly that gift would become a battlefield. The months immediately following my grandmother's death passed in a haze of grief I navigated mostly alone, my parents and Lauren absorbed in their own version of mourning that somehow rarely intersected with mine in any meaningful way. I continued running my studio, teaching my regular classes, finding a strange comfort in the repetitive physicality of centering clay on the wheel during a period when very little else in my life felt centered at all. I visited the beach house twice during those months, alone, walking through rooms still filled with my grandmother's presence, her reading glasses on the side table, her favorite chipped mug in the kitchen cabinet, the particular quality of afternoon light through the screened porch where she'd taught me to throw pots on a small portable wool during the summer I turned 12. It was about 6 weeks after the wool reading that Lauren first visited my studio, an event significant enough in itself that I should have registered it immediately as unusual, given that my sister rarely made time for visits that didn't serve some specific purpose connected to her own busy life. She arrived during my Tuesday evening class, waiting somewhat impatiently near the door until my students had left, her expression carrying a kind of strained brightness I recognized but couldn't immediately place. "The studio looks great," she said, glancing around with an attention that felt performed rather than genuine. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something. The clinic's been struggling more than I let on to Mom and Dad. We're looking at some serious cash flow problems, and I've been thinking, that beach house Grandma left you, it's basically just sitting there most of the year, right? Have you thought about what selling it might actually mean for the family?" I felt something tighten in my chest, standing there with clay dust still on my hands. "I hadn't really thought about selling it, Lauren. Grandma left it to me specifically." I know," she said quickly, her hand moving in a small, dismissive gesture. "I'm not saying you have to do anything right now. I'm just saying, Mom's been asking about it, and I think she has some thoughts about how the family might handle things going forward." I didn't push further in that moment. I told myself Lauren was simply under genuine financial stress, reaching out the way any sibling might during a difficult period, and that her mention of our mother's thoughts was probably less significant than the slightly anxious undertone in her voice suggested. That assumption would prove costly in the weeks that followed. A few days after Lauren's studio visit, my father called, another event notable simply for its rarity, since Howard generally left most direct family communication to my mother, maintaining a kind of practiced distance from anything resembling emotional conversation. "Your mother mentioned Lauren talked to you about the beach house situation," he said, his tone carrying the particular brisk efficiency he used when discussing anything he considered settled rather than open for genuine discussion. "I think it would mean a lot to this family if you considered helping your sister out. She's worked so hard, Hazel. The clinic could really turn things around with the right capital injection." I stood in my studio's small office, phone pressed against my ear, feeling the familiar, exhausting pull of wanting to please my father colliding with a growing unease I couldn't yet fully name. "Dad, I need time to think about this. It's a significant decision." Of course," he said, though something in his quick agreement felt less like genuine patience and more like a formality he was moving through before circling back to the actual point. "Just keep it in mind. Family helps family, you know that." I hung up the phone feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't fully articulate, replaying the conversation, noting how quickly both Lauren and my father had moved from, "Have you thought about it?" to language that already assumed my eventual compliance. I didn't confront either of them directly about this pattern. I told myself I was probably overreacting, that my family simply communicated about difficult topics with more directness than I was comfortable with, rather than anything more calculated. There was a Sunday dinner, about 3 weeks after my father's call, when I watched my mother interact with Lauren in a way that struck me, even through my determined optimism, as oddly charged. Pamela kept glancing toward me throughout the meal, her expression carrying a calculating quality I'd rarely seen so visibly, before quickly redirecting her attention back to Lauren whenever I noticed her watching me. I filed that observation away without examining it closely. I told myself, once again, that I was reading too much into ordinary family dynamics, searching for hidden meaning in glances that probably meant nothing more than a mother's general attentiveness to both her daughters. I understand now that this persistent hope, that my family's behavior toward me carried no hidden agenda, that their love simply expressed itself differently than I sometimes wished it would, was the exact blind spot that allowed everything that followed to develop as completely as it did. The unease that had been building since my father's phone call sharpened considerably about 2 months before that birthday party, triggered by a series of small, accumulating details I could no longer fully dismiss. I'd started noticing that family conversations, even ones that began about unrelated topics, found their way back to the beach house with increasing frequency. My mother mentioned it during a casual phone call about an entirely different subject, working it into the conversation with a casualness that felt, in retrospect, considerably more deliberate than it had seemed in the moment. There was a particular Tuesday, about 6 weeks before the party, when I received a text message from an unknown number, a brief, cryptic warning that read simply, "Don't go to your birthday dinner without protecting yourself first. You deserve to know what's actually being planned." I stared at that message for a long time, sitting alone in my apartment, feeling a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the evening's temperature. I tried calling the number back. It had already been disconnected. I considered showing the message to Lauren or my parents, then immediately reconsidered, uncertain whether revealing it might alert whoever was planning something to cover their tracks more carefully. I want to be honest about something here. I had every opportunity, in the weeks following that warning text, to investigate more aggressively, to ask my parents directly what exactly was being planned for my birthday celebration. I didn't take that opportunity fully. Some part of me, even with this clear warning in hand, still clung to the hope that I was misreading an innocent family gathering, that the anonymous message reflected someone else's paranoia rather than an actual conspiracy against me. I told myself I was being given the benefit of the doubt by holding back my suspicions, when in reality, I understand now, I was simply protecting myself from having to confront how deliberately my family might be capable of manipulating me. About 3 weeks before the party, I drove out to the beach house alone, ostensibly to check on routine maintenance, but really, I think, to feel close to my grandmother during a period when my unease about my family's intentions had become increasingly difficult to ignore. While there, going through some boxes my grandmother had left in the hall closet that I hadn't yet fully sorted through, I found a sealed envelope tucked inside an old photo album, addressed simply, in my grandmother's distinctive looping handwriting, "For Hazel, when she needs it most." I sat on the floor of that familiar hallway for a long time before opening it, somehow understanding, even before reading a single word, that whatever was inside mattered enormously. The letter inside was brief but unmistakably clear in its intention. My grandmother had written about her decision to leave me the house specifically, about her concerns regarding how my parents and Lauren might eventually respond to that decision, and about a woman named Constance, someone I'd never heard mentioned before, who, the letter explained, had been present during several conversations in my grandmother's final months and could be trusted, if circumstances ever required it, to help me understand the full truth about my family's intentions. I held that letter for a long time, the ocean audible through the screened porch beyond the hallway, feeling something shift permanently in my understanding of my grandmother's final months, and in my growing certainty that whatever my family was planning extended well beyond simple financial pressure. I didn't act on the letter's instructions immediately. I told myself I needed more clarity before reaching out to a stranger based on a deceased woman's handwritten note, that perhaps Constance had been simply a hospice worker or distant acquaintance whose significance my grandmother had overstated in a moment of protective anxiety near the end of her life. That hesitation would cost me valuable preparation time, though, as I would soon understand, not nearly as much as it might have, because the warning text I'd received weeks earlier had clearly come from someone already working to protect me, even before I fully understood I needed protecting. It was during this period, my suspicion mounting steadily despite my reluctance to fully confront it, that I began noticing something in Lauren's behavior during our occasional phone calls that struck me as different from her usual confident efficiency. During one call, about 2 weeks before the party, discussing what I assumed was simply birthday party logistics, Lauren's voice carried an unusual tightness when the conversation turned, as it inevitably did, toward the beach house. "Mom's really excited about how everything's going to come together," she said, then paused in a way that felt loaded, before adding quickly, "For your birthday, I mean. The party." I noted the slight stumble in her phrasing, the quick correction, and felt something cold move through my stomach even as I told myself, once again, that I was probably overanalyzing an innocent verbal slip. I didn't know it then, but Lauren had been carrying considerably more anxiety about the upcoming confrontation than her composed phone manner suggested. She told me, much later, what had actually been happening in her mind during that call. "I almost told you everything right then. Mom had been planning this for weeks, getting Dad to help draft some kind of family statement, deciding the party would be the perfect setting because you'd never cause a scene in front of 40 guests, you'd never want to embarrass the family publicly. I knew it was manipulative. I told myself I was simply helping save my clinic, that you'd understand eventually why this mattered so much, that the house was just sitting there mostly empty while real, immediate suffering was happening at my practice. Every time I talked to you during those weeks, I felt this rising guilt that I kept pushing down by reminding myself how much my patients needed the clinic to survive. I almost warned you that day on the phone. I told myself silence was simply discretion, protecting a surprise. I think now it was cowardice, letting Mom's plan move forward because confronting it directly would have meant admitting how far I was willing to let this go. I didn't know any of that in the moment, of course. I just registered the unsettling pause, the quick correction, and added it to a growing pile of details I still wasn't quite ready to fully assemble into the picture they actually formed. With the warning text, my grandmother's letter, and Lauren's unsettling phone call accumulating into something I could no longer dismiss as simple paranoia, I finally decided, 10 days before the party, to track down the woman named Constance. I found her through my grandmother's address book, still kept in the beach house's kitchen drawer, a local number that, when I called, connected me to a woman whose voice carried an immediate warmth that felt, somehow, instantly trustworthy. I wondered when you might call, Constance said, once I'd explained who I was and why I was reaching out. Your grandmother asked me to keep something for you, just in case. I think it's time you heard it. We met 2 days later at a small coffee shop near the beach house, and Constance, who explained that she'd been my grandmother's hospice companion during her final months, handed me a small digital recorder along with an explanation that made my hands go cold even before she finished speaking. Your grandmother overheard a conversation about 6 weeks before she passed, Constance said. Your mother had come to visit, didn't realize Eleanor was awake in the next room, and was on the phone with your sister. Eleanor asked me to record what she could hear, just in case it ever became necessary for you to know exactly what they were already planning, even while she was still alive. I sat in that coffee shop, the recorder small and impossibly heavy in my palm, feeling the floor of my understanding shift completely. I asked Constance if I could listen to it there, and she nodded, watching my face with an expression of careful, protective concern as I pressed play. My mother's voice, slightly muffled but unmistakably hers, filled the small device. Once Mother passes, the house goes to Hazel, but we'll handle that. She's always been the more agreeable one, we just need the right setting, somewhere she won't want to cause a scene. Maybe her birthday, something with enough people around that she'll feel pressured to just go along with it gracefully. Lauren's voice responded, fainter but audible, you really think she'll just sign it over because we ask her to, in front of everyone? She will if we frame it right, my mother's voice continued. We make it about family, about her finally getting the chance to really matter, to do something significant instead of playing with clay all day. She's wanted our approval her whole life. We just have to make this feel like the moment she finally earns it. I sat frozen, the recording continuing for another minute with logistical details about timing and guest lists, while something inside me broke and reformed simultaneously, grief for the validation I'd spent my entire life hoping for, and a clarifying, devastating understanding of exactly how calculated that validation had actually been, weaponized into a tool for extracting what they wanted from me. I want to be honest about something here, even with this recording in hand, undeniable proof of my family's calculated manipulation, I still felt, sitting in that coffee shop, a flicker of desperate hope that there might be some context I was missing, some explanation that would make this less devastating than it appeared. Constance, watching my face, seemed to understand exactly what I was feeling. Your grandmother knew this would be hard for you to accept, she said gently. She didn't want you to be ambushed without warning. She loved you very much, Hazel. I think that's the most important thing for you to hold on to right now. I left that coffee shop with the recorder safely stored in my bag, the beach house keys cold against my palm, and a clarity I hadn't possessed in months. I would attend my birthday party as planned. But I would arrive prepared, for the first time in my life, to finally show my family exactly what I discovered about who they actually were. The birthday party unfolded almost exactly as the recording had described. 40 guests gathered in my parents' backyard, string lights strung between the oak trees, a cake my mother had ordered specifically decorated with my name in elaborate script, the entire scene staged with a warmth that I now understood to be entirely calculated. I arrived with the recorder in my purse, Constance's number saved in my phone in case I needed reassurance during what I knew would be one of the hardest conversations of my life, and a steadiness I hadn't expected to feel given everything I now understood about the trap waiting for me. The ambush came exactly as predicted, near the end of the meal, just before the cake was meant to be cut. My mother stood, tapped her glass, and made her announcement to the assembled crowd, that I had decided, generously, to sign over my grandmother's beach house to help save Lauren's struggling clinic, framing it as a celebration of my newfound generosity rather than what it actually was, a public ambush designed to make refusal feel impossible. I stood near the dessert table, set down my plate, and felt the entire backyard's attention turn toward me with an expectant warmth that had nothing to do with anything I had actually agreed to. "That's not true," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet yard. "I never agreed to sign anything over to anyone." My mother's expression flickered, confusion, quickly recalibrating into something more defensive. "Hazel, sweetheart, we talked about this. I thought we'd agreed." "We never talked about this, Mom," I said. "Lauren mentioned it once, in passing. Dad called once, vaguely. Nobody ever actually asked me a direct question and waited for my actual answer. You just decided this was happening and announced it to 40 people so I'd feel too embarrassed to say no in front of everyone." The yard had gone completely silent now, guests exchanging uncertain glances, my father's face draining of color near the head of the table. "I have something I need everyone to hear," I continued, reaching into my purse for the recorder, my hand steadier than I expected given how violently my heart was pounding. 6 weeks before my grandmother died, she overheard a conversation between my mother and my sister. She had it recorded, because she suspected exactly this kind of ambush might happen. I pressed play, and my mother's voice, "We just need the right setting, somewhere she won't want to cause a scene," filled the suddenly silent backyard, followed by Lauren's response, followed by the rest of the calculated, devastating plan laid out exactly as they'd designed it. The reaction around the yard happened in layers, almost in slow motion. Aunt Susan's hand flew to her mouth. Uncle Frank's expression hardened into something I'd never seen from him before, quiet, controlled fury directed at my mother. Several guests began quietly gathering their things, the particular body language of people calculating how quickly they could leave without seeming to flee a scene that had suddenly become unbearably uncomfortable. My mother's composure shattered almost immediately. "That recording is doctored," she said, her voice rising, panic threading through the forced certainty. "This is exactly the kind of manipulation I'd expect from someone who's been listening to who knows what kind of poison about this family." "It's not doctored, Mom," I said quietly. "Constance has the original, along with a written account from Grandma about exactly when and how this conversation happened. I'd be happy to have it independently verified if you'd like." "You've always resented your sister's success," my mother continued, her voice cracking now, desperation replacing her earlier confidence. "This is just another way for you to make yourself the victim, to make Lauren look bad in front of everyone who actually loves this family." "Mom," Lauren's voice cut in, unexpectedly, and I turned to see my sister standing near the cake table, her face pale, her composure completely collapsed. "Stop. Just stop. She has the recording. Everyone heard it." My mother turned toward Lauren, something close to betrayal flickering across her face, but Lauren didn't back down, her own voice gaining strength even as it shook with what looked like genuine, overwhelming shame. "I need to tell everyone the truth," Lauren said, turning toward the gathered guests, her voice carrying a raw vulnerability I'd rarely witnessed from my confident, accomplished sister. "This started about 4 months ago, when I finally admitted to myself that the clinic was going to fail without a massive infusion of capital I didn't have any legitimate way to access. I remember the exact night. I was sitting in my office after closing, staring at the financial statements, feeling this complete, overwhelming panic about everything I'd built collapsing. I called Mom that night, just to talk, and somewhere in that conversation, she mentioned, almost casually, that Hazel had inherited the beach house, and that it was probably just sitting there mostly unused. I remember the exact moment something shifted in me. I told myself this wasn't really manipulation, just a practical solution to a genuine problem, that Hazel would surely understand once she knew how desperate things had actually become. Mom and I started talking more seriously about it after that, and I told myself, every single time, that I was protecting something important rather than doing something wrong. When Mom suggested the birthday party setting, I felt this flash of discomfort, genuinely, but I pushed it down by reminding myself how many patients depended on my clinic staying open. I told myself the ends justified whatever discomfort this caused you in the moment. The truth is, somewhere underneath all that justification, I knew exactly what we were doing. I knew it was manipulative, calculated, designed specifically to exploit how badly you've always wanted this family's approval. I let it happen anyway, because admitting how desperate I'd become felt like a worse failure than what we were doing to you. I'm not asking you to forgive this right now. I just needed everyone here to understand that you're not making this up, you're not being paranoid or vindictive. You're telling the truth about something I should have stopped weeks ago, and didn't. The backyard remained silent after Lauren finished speaking, the weight of her confession settling over the gathered guests with a heaviness that felt almost physical. My father, who had said almost nothing throughout this entire confrontation, finally spoke, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Hazel, I didn't fully understand how far this had gone. I knew there was a plan, but I told myself it was simply persuasion, not, he gestured vaguely toward the recorder still in my hand, not this. You knew enough, Dad, I said quietly. You called me yourself, pushing me toward exactly what they wanted. I need you to own that, not minimize it. I looked around at the gathered faces, Uncle Frank's quiet fury, Aunt Susan's visible distress, my young cousins Sophie and Ethan watching with the particular wide-eyed shock of children witnessing adult betrayal for the first time, Grace standing close beside Sophie with an expression of fierce, protective solidarity I hadn't expected from a cousin I barely knew. I'm keeping the house, I said, my voice carrying steadily across the yard. Grandma left it to me because she trusted me, and because she understood, better than any of you apparently did, that I deserved something unconditional in this family. I'm not signing anything tonight, or any night after this. I didn't wait for my mother's response. I gathered my things, thanked Constance silently in my mind for everything she'd given me, and walked out of my parents' backyard while the party I'd never actually wanted dissolved into chaos behind me. In the weeks following that birthday party, my family's reaction unfolded in ways that surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have, given everything the recording had revealed about who they actually were beneath the surface I'd spent 30 years trying to penetrate. My mother called repeatedly during the first several days, her voicemails shifting between outraged accusations of betrayal and increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation that always, inevitably, circled back to the beach house. I let most of those calls go unanswered, finding, for the first time in my life, a kind of peace in simply not engaging with manipulation I now recognized clearly for what it was. Uncle Frank and Aunt Susan reached out separately, their messages carrying genuine warmth and explicit condemnation of my mother's behavior that I hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. I've watched your mother treat you differently than Lauren for 30 years, Aunt Susan wrote, and I should have said something long before this. I'm sorry it took something this extreme for the rest of the family to finally see it clearly. Several relatives, I learned through Aunt Susan, had left the party immediately after Lauren's confession, visibly shaken by what they'd witnessed. A handful of others reached out in the following weeks, some offering support, others, more cautiously, asking for my own account of what had actually happened, as if needing to reconcile the version of my family they'd believed in with the version that recording had exposed. Lauren contacted me about 3 weeks after the party, asking if we could meet privately, away from our parents entirely. We met at a small cafe in Charlotte, neutral ground for both of us, and she arrived looking considerably different than the confident, accomplished sister I'd known my entire life, smaller somehow, the polished certainty stripped away entirely. I need you to know I meant everything I said at the party, she began. I haven't told Mom or Dad this, but I've started seeing a therapist, trying to understand how I let myself get so far into something I knew was wrong. I keep coming back to this idea that I'd convinced myself, somewhere along the way, that your feelings simply mattered less than mine, that you'd always accommodate whatever the family needed because that's just who you'd always been. I'm horrified, honestly, at how easily I accepted that framing without ever questioning it directly. I sat with her confession for a long moment, feeling something complicated settle in my chest, not quite forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of seeing my sister as a fully human person grappling with her own desperate choices, rather than simply the family's golden child whose manipulation I'd absorbed without ever fully understanding its cost. I appreciate you telling me this, I finally said. I'm not ready to know what our relationship looks like going forward. But I believe you're being honest right now, and that matters. My mother, for her part, never offered anything close to genuine accountability. She called once more, about 2 months after the party, her voice carrying a brittle, transactional warmth that I recognized immediately as another negotiation rather than authentic reconciliation. If you publicly apologize for embarrassing this family at your own birthday party, she said, and reconsider helping your sister, I think we could put all of this behind us." I felt something settle in me at that, a clarity I hadn't expected to feel so completely. "I'm not apologizing for telling the truth, Mom. If you ever want an honest relationship with me, one based on actual respect rather than what you can extract from me, I'm open to that conversation. But I'm not negotiating the house, and I'm not pretending what happened at that party was anything other than what it actually was." She hung up without responding, and I haven't heard from her since, though I understand, through occasional updates from Aunt Susan, that she continues describing the incident to extended family members in a version that conveniently omits the recording entirely. I kept the beach house. I spend most weekends there now, often with my pottery students for small workshop retreats I've started organizing on the screened porch where my grandmother first taught me to center clay on a wheel. Constance and I have stayed close, an unexpected friendship born from her loyalty to my grandmother's final wishes, and through her, I've built a small circle of chosen family that has come to mean more to me than I ever expected anything could, given how completely my biological family's approval once organized my entire sense of self-worth. My pottery studio has grown, too, in the months since that birthday party, not dramatically, but steadily, fueled by a confidence I hadn't possessed before I finally stopped organizing my choices around earning validation I now understand I was never actually going to receive, regardless of how much I sacrificed in pursuit of it. I am still Hazel, still a ceramic artist, still someone who finds meaning in creating something beautiful and lasting with her own two hands. But I am not the daughter who believed her family's love depended on her eventual usefulness anymore. I'm someone who finally understands that real love doesn't require an ambush, a recorded confession, or a public reckoning to prove itself genuine. There's a particular kind of family manipulation that's hardest to recognize because it arrives wrapped in celebration rather than obvious cruelty. My mother's ambush looked, on its surface, like generosity, like a daughter finally being given the chance to matter, and I understand now why that framing made it so devastatingly effective for so long. Recognizing it directly would have meant confronting the much larger, more painful truth that my family's approval had always been conditional, dependent on what I was willing to sacrifice rather than who I actually was. Looking back, Lauren's nervous stumble during that phone call wasn't simply an innocent verbal slip. It was the visible edge of a guilt she was already carrying, weeks before the party, that I noticed and set aside because acknowledging it fully would have required confronting a betrayal I wasn't yet ready to fully accept. I had pieces of this conspiracy long before I had its complete shape, and I understand now that I wasn't naive so much as deeply invested in believing my family capable of better than what they actually showed me. The real turning point wasn't the birthday party confrontation itself, dramatic as that day became. It was the quiet moment, alone in that coffee shop with Constance, when I finally allowed myself to fully accept what the recording revealed, rather than continuing to search for some alternative explanation that might make my family's calculation less devastating. I had spent 30 years believing that patient hope would eventually be rewarded with genuine acceptance. What I learned, finally, sitting in my parents' backyard with that recorder in my hand, is that some families require external proof, undeniable and irrefutable, before they're willing to recalculate decades of comfortable self-deception, and that you cannot wait indefinitely for that reckoning to arrive on someone else's terms. What I learned, in the end, wasn't really about the beach house, though its value to me extends far beyond anything financial. It was about understanding that love offered conditionally, only when you're willing to sacrifice something significant in return, was never actually unconditional acceptance in the first place, and that recognizing this distinction, however painful, is the only way to finally stop organizing your worth around people who were never planning to offer it freely. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this: notice when generosity is being demanded of you publicly, in settings specifically chosen because you'd feel too embarrassed to refuse. Notice when your family's love arrives wrapped in conditions you've simply learned not to examine too closely. You don't have to wait for a recorded confession at your own birthday party to trust what you already sense about how you're actually being treated. I hope you don't have to. But if some part of this story sounded familiar, if some part of you recognized yourself in the daughter whose patient hope was quietly exploited for decades, let this be the moment you finally stop waiting for an approval that conditions itself on what you're willing to give away. I'm not angry anymore, most days. I'm something steadier than that now. Something that finally feels, after everything, completely and quietly my own.